Thank you very much indeed. I'm Principal Fellow at the sibling Research Institute of Sociotechnical Cybersecurity. Broadly what we do is we look at social, economic, policy barriers to using security technologies, and then we think about how we might respond to those. Sometimes we get involved in the design or the new design of technologies. Sometimes we look at how we might soften some of the unintended harms or consequences, adverse consequences of using those technologies. Sometimes we work around implementation. So that's the bulk of what we do, and we've been doing that really since its inception around 2012. But what we also do quite a lot of now under the direction of Genevieve Lively at Bristol is we also think about futures, and we think about how near-term futures might affect the way that we use technologies that we have need for, and the economic, social and policy contexts in which they might be deployed. So that's what risks is. My name is Lizzie, and I'm not a mathematician or a computer scientist. So this is mildly terrifying, but I will get over it. I'm actually a linguist by trade. That's how I started, and wound up working in computer security in 1990. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it. But wound up working in practice for about 17 years. Came into Royal Holloway, so I had my PhD, and I was working on a systems security project. It was a project looking at why people disclose what they disclose online and how we might make those decisions sort of more effective. And I'm doing some work with community groups up in the Northeast who'd, broadly speaking, had digital systems, digital services imposed upon them for welfare, for health primarily, and for housing. And we were talking about that old chestnut password management, and I was talking about password hygiene, and I was giving some ideas of what I thought, this is how we should work, because I saw it as a public good, really. And I got two responses. Why should I? And make me. And that wasn't quite in the script. Okay, this is interesting. And basically, I've spent the last 17 years trying to figure out how to make digital security effective and useful for people who are in economically and socially precarious settings. And I figure that if you can get it to work in that setting, we can pretty much get it to work across the piece. And risks has been a very happy home for me to do that work. What I want to talk about today are a couple of things. I want to think a little bit about intelligent automation, the sorts of observations that we have in the field, and how that might change the focus of what we know as sociotechnical cybersecurity. I guess for many of you, sociotechnical cybersecurity is primarily about password hygiene. It's about that sort of cyber hygiene side. And I think that is changing quite dramatically. And I think it opens up lots of scope for interaction and collaboration, the sorts of topics that you've been talking about, I think. So let's explore that a little bit. And then I want to sort of think about how we see the social in this machine to system setting, where people don't necessarily have their hands on the keyboards, where they're being censored, where they're being observed, where they're having systems that are responding to their behaviors. We're beginning to see that emerge slightly. I wonder where that might go from a futures perspective. And then I'd really like to have a conversation. So I try and stop in sort of with 10 minutes to spare so we can talk about what are practical actions for co-design across our two sort of communities. But let's start, as I often do, with a picture. So this was drawn for me by artist Alice Angers in 2018. And it's a useful way for me to talk about the context that I'm sort of engaging with. Some of you will have seen this picture several times before, but every time I work with this picture when I'm developing a talk, what's interesting is that I always see something very different. So at some point it'll get a refresh, but right now there still seems to be things to say. All right, so I want to just take you a little bit around this picture. Can we go to the council building? Council buildings are fascinating, or what's happened with councils has been fascinating. quietly, robotic process automation has come in the 2010s. And for many councils, that's been a technology that's been used to do a very boring thing of lifting and shifting data and organizing data. And it kind of happened under the radar. I first came across robotic process automation in Sweden, looking at the automation of welfare, came back to the UK and discovered that we were doing quite a bit of robotic process automation in moving and sorting and basically making the data neat and tidy. Then what comes in quietly in sort of probably the late 2019s, early 2020s, is we start to see an automation layer come onto that. Very basic automation, for example, for things like free school meals. You eligible, yes or no? And gradually that grows more and more. And of course, none of this is systematic. It's piecemeal. Couple of things that fascinate me, having listened to the talks this morning, which I loved, by the way, I've had a blast, thank you, is the fact that a lot of this work is done by a person in a cupboard. And often a person in the cupboard that isn't actually part of the organization. They come in, they're consultants, you'll know the score. They come in, they do the work. I'm guessing handover documentation isn't big. Sometimes they have a good relationship. They tend to be quite small companies that sort of secure these services, but they pretty much happen in the background where they're automated, right? So why are we worried about it? What's interesting here is how that looks when you're the person literally in the street and you're engaging. Because that social contract that you think that you have, that I'm going to come back to several times in this talk, that social contract you think you're having is with somebody like you that can relate to you, making a decision about your free school meal, yes or no. He said, you haven't got that. You've not got anywhere near a human being. That decision is being made by a system. It's not necessarily a problem. It just changes our framing. It changes how we see that building. And COVID dramatically changed the way that many of our councils operate, the amount to which we actually have physical presence there, and the amount to which people actually engage with individuals. We then swing around and we go to the chemist. Of course, the chemist is where we know that healthcare provision has really started to be interleaved with different types of technology, quite often so-called intelligent automation, looking at doing sort of analysis of you, looking at your needs, deciding when, how, what sort of healthcare that you get. It relies, of course, on you having particular types of technology available to you. It relies on you having data on your phone. It relies on you having time and able to work out the sequencing to make those type of requests. So it's quite possible that you might pop next door to the library to get some help to figure out how to drive that. Several reasons for that. During COVID, we did quite a lot of sort of surveying of some of the groups that we worked with, and we discovered interesting things about this healthcare automation coming into use. The main one being data, and the data fights that happen within families, because it tends to be that younger people in a family have more data than older people in a family. So I need to make a healthcare request. I'm possibly going to have to barter with my son in order to get that data, in order to make that request, because I can't go and see the doctor. Is it necessarily a problem? Well, it can be a problem. But what it just tells us is the nature of that interaction's changed, and there are different problems occurring. I'm not saying they're worse problems, but they're problems. These are sorts of frictions that happen. Moving around to the front here, to the Bluetooth in. What I was really struck by with the talks is the gorgeous calm that descends and the way in which you all talk in sequences, right? Your pacing is actually quite impressive. And what's really interesting here is that the worlds I work in, they're chaotic. So what could be happening in the Bluetooth in is a lot of noise, definitely a lot of noise. You've probably got several things going on at once. Somebody might be focusing on a task, maybe maybe a work task, but you've got lots of different things happening in that environment, which is not conducive to using security controls, because you're actually sensory overload is not uncommon in that type of setting. So why don't you go home? Because you've got your Wi-Fi there, that's why. You've also got heat there, you've got warmth there, you've got people there. So lots of reasons why people work in public spaces and can do some very sophisticated tasks. Pop across the road, up to the top there. One of my favorite places on this picture is at the top in the office. This could be the type of place in which you have people doing coding, maybe local coding for the council office, maybe some local coding to help the library. You could be somebody who works remotely and you go to that place in order to do that remote working. And of course, with the advent of Copilot, with the advent of our generative AI tools, what you can do and what you're able to produce is, of course, increasing. So those spaces are super interesting when I think about the principles, okay, very abstracted, the types of principles you've been talking about this morning, and thinking about how you get principles, the sort of tooling actually to work in that space. I find that really interesting. It's probably a big leap, but I found it really interesting. And then my favorite part on this picture is the person in the middle with the phone. So we've always talked, since 2018, we've talked about that character as maybe making a work call, maybe talking to friends and family, maybe talking to the bank. But my view of that picture has changed in the last couple of months. So I'm at a department at the moment, I don't get out much. And when I do get out, I went to see one of the community groups that I've worked with for a long time. This is a classic resource-strapped environment. It's a sort of deprived socioeconomic area. The community group that I work with is primarily there to help people get back into work. It's always been an environment where they're using legacy kit, they're using legacy networks, they're using legacy laptops. I walk in the door, sit down, I have a cup of tea and a Kit Kat because that's where we start. And I start to realize that there's been a real shift in practice and that many of the claimants are using Copilot to write their welfare claim statements, which might not seem a big deal to you, but the reasons for doing it are super interesting. They, of course, are specialists in their own case. They've probably been writing these claims for a long time, but they're using Copilot because they think it will put it in a language that will be better received by whatever system is doing the filtering at the other end. They've looked at the system, they figured out what sorts of claims score points, what don't score points, and they're using Copilot to help them fine-tune their claim in order to get a better response and therefore increase income or the likelihood of income. I then pop next door to the people who run frontline on these services, and they are all using some kind of assistive technology. Why is this a big deal? This is a big deal because this is an environment that is typically quite slow to adopt, adopts under pressure, adopts because they have to. And they've moved fast. And I asked why. I said, how did this happen, right? You don't normally adopt technology. And the route is the same. It came in via their kids, who were all using that technology to do their homework. And from there, they've learned the skills and they've brought it back in. But they're not stopping there. They're not stopping just to produce reports. They're also generating content. They're also talking about the ways in which this content is being used back against them with things like cheap fakes and how that's disrupting the flow of food distribution, how that's disrupting the way in which local political activity takes place. So that figure in the middle is fascinating because all bets are off as to what that figure in the middle is doing. And I think that makes what you've been talking about today even more salient, even more important than it has been previously, because that space, my world and your world, which 6 months ago would have been really quite separate, are beginning to collide. And I find that super interesting. A couple of shifts I want to talk about. So computer says yes, computer says no. This is the tyranny of the computer saying yes and no is really quite key here, because we're talking about trust with a big T and trust with a small t. So we've got responsibility shift. What we often see, and particularly the more you deliver services digitally, is technological security being made to do something it wasn't designed for, is to enforce policy. Age verification is one of my favorites, right? Quite a contested topic in certain areas, but our sorts of technology are being used to push that policy through. And that's not a view on whether that's a good policy or a bad policy. I am simply observing that the technology works better when we buy into the security goals, when we buy in to the point of what it's asking us to do. That saves a lot of friction, it saves a lot of pushback, and it leaves the code available to actually prevent the types of issues that it was designed to attempt, rather than to get us all to comply. One of the things that is also key here is responsibilization of the end user. So for years, ever since I started working in these areas, the move has been responsibility pushed out to the end user. Really interesting question as to who the end user is if I don't have my hands on the keyboard, if it's my body or it's my behavior. That's an interesting question. But what's also interesting is the sorts of work that you do that I would argue pulls responsibility back into the stack, into the software where it actually belongs. And one of the big barriers and challenges that we work with in risks is how to get the ecosystem to buy into that placement of responsibility. And I think that's probably an area that we could really work on together. And then this automation of back-end services, this silent, creeping automation that really changes the social contract, changes the basis on which we engage with systems without us realizing. And why that's important, again, is because that's how we negotiate. In that social contract, we negotiate what security goals matter. I come back to why should I and make me. That breakdown really comes from people not buying into the security goals that you're setting out, not saying that what your security goals are not my security goals. And that's where a lot of work has been lost. If I could get in a time machine and go back to the 2000s, what would I be arguing for in terms of research? What I would be arguing for is to do some grounded studies to look at what happens when we automate services, when we bring in the digital, we remove the face-to-face. I'm not advocating the face-to-face should come back. I'm really not, because there was lots of bias, lots of abuse that went into face-to-face as well. But I am saying that we've lost the point where we do negotiation for what are the security goals that matter to us. And the more we can get that agreement, the more we dial down the white noise, the more that we let controls do what they were designed to do. Okay, so that leads to the more radical binding, using biometrics, the way that we tie services to individuals, giving less opportunity for assistance. That's one place in which we lose that kind of malleability. And the grey zone, the computer says yes or no. And that grey zone, you're kind of 2 days late, but go on, put it in, that's okay. These are really actually important interactions. That sort of the soft fuzzy edge around compliance is where we negotiate and where we do that kind of interaction, and we are losing it. And as a result, we're building resistance. Okay. So we can see here that we've gone beyond usable security, usable passwords. They're still there. All that usable authentication is still important. But we also have to critically reflect on the power and the power relations. One of the reasons I think why you're seeing this rapid adoption around assistive technologies is partly the feeling, although we might debate it, but the feeling that you're getting more power, the power tilt is coming back towards you. You're able to respond to a system with a system and the kind of powers that gives you. we can debate it given how these technologies are produced, but that is a sense that it gives, and that power relation is super important. And understanding the policy context into which these technologies are used are also important, because increasingly, as you attenuate that connection between government and individual, you also attenuate the discussion around why we're doing this in the first place. And you're putting an awful lot on the technology to kind of fix. And the final thing I wanted to talk to is also what we're looking at a lot more now in risks is the interaction between protective security, which I think is largely what you've been talking about this morning, so protection from harms, and positive security, which is about being able to be free from fear, to go out and do what you need to do to get up, to get out, to get on. What people are really focused on is positive security, with negative security supporting that, because it's very hard to have one without the other. And it's about how we acknowledge both the opportunity as well as the protection, and how we find models to be able to do that. Okay, so if we don't do that, if we don't think in this broader way, if we don't acknowledge that trust with a big T is sort of problematic here for us, where do we get to? Well, we have to recognize that for every sort of enforcement action, there are many reactions. Often we can't figure out what they are until they've happened. This is a lot of where Genevieve's work with futures literacy comes in. And this splintering of goals, which I've already talked about. Where's the point at which we agree what the security goals are, so that we keep people together and not splintering off into shadow and parallel capabilities? And then how do we dial down the white noise? So my last big picture, but it's one that I really wanted to highlight, and then we'll get into how might we work together in discussion. So there are three types of exclusion that we're really talking about here. This bottom corner here with the person with the map trying to figure out how to get into the system, you might say, well, I don't really, I'm sorry, obviously, morally I don't like it, but how is this a security problem? So what's really interesting here is that, of course, these are all someone's brother, sister, parent, child. And this type of exclusion ripples out through communities. And the most anger I see in people is having rubbish help and support systems to get them in. And we don't teach our computer science students how to write good help notes. We don't teach them with our service designers, we don't look at what good help and support looks like. And that's something that I think we should really take note of, because that would really dial down a lot of anger that can then wind up in that middle column, which is people figuring out how to have a go, have a crack at the system. And my worry, the futures that I'm seeing emerge, is that the more we get technology into people's hands, the more we're not tunneling in or abseiling, the more we're doing it with code in ways that we don't really understand, because they didn't come through our education systems. They don't sit in places that we get or understand, with outlooks that we get or understand, but they're using technology quite potentially in a very powerful way that disrupts a lot of the ways that we build security. So I think understanding that resistance and that reaction is super important. And then into that back column, which is not the greatest picture, but what we're trying to represent in that sort of merry-go-round type construction at the back, is people creating parallel systems. There are obvious examples of parallel systems. Uber is a really great example. Cryptocurrencies are another example. But of course, we've got lots of low-scale alternative systems growing every day. And that lovely points about tooling that you've made, lovely points about, really important points about standards that you've made. How do we engage with something that's parallel, that's happening outside of our purview, that's potentially creating things for people that are inherently, right from the ground up, not trustworthy from its core component upwards? How do we look at that? Okay, so very quickly, I think the hardest point about having conversations across these ways of looking is to get the right level of abstraction. How do you build a nuanced understanding of how technological security can be felt and experienced? Where is that needed? How is that needed? How do we bring that into testing? At what point do we bring it into testing? How does that work? Clearly doesn't work at the sorts of levels you've been talking about, but it's not, we don't have to go many layers up before it really does. And how do we do that connecting and bridging? What kind of modeling are we using? What are the different abstractions that we can kind of understand from each other? I think that's extremely important. And I think also understanding security technology, not just in terms of its functions, but also the stories that it tells, what it prioritizes. The use of the word efficiency, I think, is really interesting and really important. These efficiency narratives, I think, are ones that we possibly maybe we could nuance, we could flesh out. Efficiency is important. It's a vital part of scale. We simply have more people now needing more services. We've got to get it to scale. But there are different types of efficiency that we need to take into account. And efficiency in terms of getting this buy-in around the social contract, where do we do that? How do we do that? Is it just a human-to-human interaction? Can it be in part built into the code? I think that's a really important question that we should perhaps explore. So my final slide is practical actions. I have had a blast today. I think more two-way education would be great, because what I did in the early 2000s around software implementation, this is not where you are now, right? Obvious point. And so understanding what the philosophies are that underpin your tooling packages, understanding what standards mean to you and how that works. Understanding, I love the point, I think it's Alistair from you, around what bugs are important and what bugs aren't. How do we work out saliency and importance? And how does that work? How does that work in this sort of multi-security gold community? Do they speak to each other or don't they? And I think also, how do we get testing, when testing is right, how do we get that into empirically derived experiences? Too often I sit in meetings where the software is designed, there's been some testing done, and then we talk in anecdotal form about all the people that won't work for. I'd really like to get that systematically in. How do we get that systematically in a way that is meaningful for the different people within that group? And I'd like to stop there, acknowledge Alice for her work, and take any questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions. Anyone has any?
Wow, fantastic talk. I'm Andy Gordon from Cogna. Yes. We're a software company. So just a detail I picked up on, you were talking about the grey areas.
Yeah.
It was quite early on, and how you were regretting that the sort of grey areas were going away. And I felt that kind of flies against what we do in a more formal point of view, where we want to avoid ambiguity if possible.
Yeah.
But even in what I'm doing in our AI software company, we're just this week very worried about ambiguities in specs that we have. So I just wondered if you could maybe expand a bit on that thought.
Absolutely. And I really picked that up earlier, right? They're kind of sort of, but not really. I found that really interesting, that distinction. So I think, so when I think about ambiguity, what I'm talking about is where the rules say X, but we can kind of go with Y, right? It's as though this is very much at a very high level compliance perspective. So a really good one for this. It's not entirely security, but you can map it across. When you're submitting your job searches online, universal credit, you have to have it in a very specific order and format, right? Or at least historically you did, whether it's like that this year, but it was always like that last year. And when you've got a lot of things happening and you've only got a small amount of time on whatever device you're using, perhaps you're probably using a phone, that can be quite traumatic, quite difficult, because actually I suspect most of us in this room take sequencing of tasks as a thing most of us do. I guess otherwise you wouldn't be here. Maybe I got that wrong, but I'm guessing, right? So if I'm working out how to, even just to access a system, I kind of get the rhythm of authentication. So it's probably a bit humanities-y. But anyway, I get the rhythm of and I kind of sequence my actions. Some people can't. They really find that difficult because they either find sequencing difficult or they're too disrupted by all the different sort of sensory things that are happening in their environment. And also they can be quite worried because if I stuff this up, I might get my claim bounced. So that's a good example of where the computer can say yes or no for quite arbitrary, because that's not the format, right? You've got to have that format, otherwise you can't go forward. In an ideal world, there would be some ambiguity. You could have some leeway, some alternatives. Because the reaction to that is, or could be, hypothetically, that I get my job club to work so that somebody's on job upload duty for 6 weeks while I go and do something else. And we basically all take it in rotation, doing each other's job searches. Could potentially happen. So that then becomes a way that I deal with that restriction that I don't think is really fair. But I think it's okay, therefore, to play the system in a way that's expected. I'm probably not being very articulate here. But the point is, series of requirements, strict format, doesn't really seem fair. It's really for the computer's benefit, not for mine. It stresses me out. I find it actually very difficult to do. It might seem like a simple task, but it's not. If I had a human being on the other end, and I'm not arguing for humans to come back, by the way, it's just really more how we code. Maybe I would go, okay, yeah, you've kind of sort of doubled up on that, but you know what? I kind of got the point, and I can see that you've done the searches. So away you go, I'll kind of sign that off. And we're losing that kind of ambiguity, and that kind of ambiguity costs us, because in that conversation of do I accept it or not accept it, I'm really having a discussion with you about what's the most important thing here. And the most important thing here is that you had a go at looking for some jobs. Does that make any kind of sense?
I'm sort of hearing that maybe you're saying you're welcoming that the system is mostly automatically making a decision, but I think you're advocating for an easy way on occasion for it to bail out and pull in a human again to clarify where there's...
Or the ability to think but the ability to accept on a broader range, right? To kind of have the constraints. That's the word I want.
I can't have the constraints saying that it may be that AI could help there.
Yeah, no, it could, and this is exactly right.
It would also go wrong.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And in fact, that was kind of in the sky that I slipped. Absolutely. I see big potential if we're incentivized to do that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bearing with me.
One from Alistair.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Really fascinating talk. I guess to follow on from what Andy was saying, something in the world of formal verification where AI is proving interesting is providing a bit of creativity that can then be completely rigorously checked.
Yes.
So for example, in formalized mathematics, we have these theorem provers like Lean and Rock, especially Lean in formal mathematics. And mathematicians, as I understand it, are using generative AI to come up with attempts to do bits of proofs. But there's no reliance on the AI to be correct. The correctness can be totally rigorously checked by the underlying tech. So when you were talking about this problem of the computer says no, I was sort of thinking I could imagine a good use of AI, to follow on from Andy's point, where maybe the rigorous requirements of the system are implicitly understood by the AI. The AI is able to sort of grok the imprecision of the user and then provide a meaningful way to tell the user what they need to do to actually get the computer to say yes and express it in natural language. And that could work in a way that wouldn't create any kind of cyber threat, because you're not able to game the system, because ultimately the system is only going to say yes as if you'd understood it, but it may be able to kind of guide you using natural language in the right way. So I wonder whether those sorts of combinations of the totally discrete yes-no reasoning of the form combined with maybe the kind of natural language processing that can be done by AI could be a good combination.
That's really interesting. And I think, I do. And I agree with both of you that there are possibilities. And as I really will stress, there's a lot wrong with human interaction, right? That doesn't help us in these situations. There's lots of examples of bias and abuse that can come in. And it, of course, also reproducibility. But it's about where we're incentivized to use that. And I guess what I'm also doing is making a connection back to the security of the system, right? Is that this will also help us with the security of the system, because we've got less people seeing it as game on, which is really, I think, what we need to dial down, because there is this view. One of the things I think I also really was very sensitive to here is that our communities have particular ways of working. We were making judgments about who can and who can't. And a lot of that is biased judgment. It's around education. It's around how we phrase things. And that's just how humans work. And what I'm really interested in is how we look at what are the skills we actually need and where we can find them from. So when I was listening to your talk, one of the things I kept thinking about is, this is really cool. How would I take some of these principles into a community center setting, right? How would this work? I mean, we'd have to completely change the language, but I think there's an awful lot of talent there. And these are kids who might have left school at 14, right? They could well have bounced out of the system, but they're not sitting twiddling their thumbs. They will be using tech and kit in lots of different ways. And AI opens that up even more. So I think there's some really exciting possibilities here. Sorry, I got carried away there, but just carry on.
Not at all. Thank you so much for. I've got many questions for you as well, and I think there are people in the audience that have questions. It was a really great talk.
Oh, thank you.
But we have to move on.
I mean, absolutely, and I will be around at 3 if there's anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lizzie.